The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace, as thousands of tourists gathered for the changing of the guard ceremony. Among them stood Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, a decorated United States Marine on his first visit to London. He had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a seasoned warrior. His uniform was crisp, his posture perfect, and his eyes held the steady gaze of someone who had seen combat. Michael had been stationed at the American Embassy for the past 6 months as part of a security detail exchange program. Today was supposed to be his day off, a chance to see the famous British ceremony that military personnel around the world had heard about, but few had witnessed firsthand. He positioned himself near the front of the crowd, his military training making him naturally observe the surroundings and assess the security protocols being followed. The British Royal Guards began their approach, their red tunics brilliant against the gray stone of the palace walls. Their black bearskin hats added an imposing height to their already tall frames. These were not ceremonial soldiers playing dress-up for tourists. These were elite infantry soldiers from regiments that had fought in Iraq, Afghanistan, and countless other conflicts throughout history. Each step they took was measured, precise, and filled with centuries of military tradition. As the ceremony began, Michael found himself studying the discipline and precision of the guards. He recognized the level of training required to maintain such perfect synchronization. Every movement was calculated, every breath controlled. The guards' faces showed no emotion, no acknowledgement of the hundreds of cameras flashing around them. They were living statues, breathing monuments to military excellence. The crowd pressed forward, eager to get closer to the spectacle. Children pointed excitedly while their parents snapped photos. Tour guides explained the history and significance of each uniform detail and ceremonial weapon. Street vendors sold miniature guard figurines and Union Jack souvenirs. The atmosphere was festive and light, filled with the chatter of dozens of different languages as visitors from around the world shared this iconic British experience. But Michael noticed something that others missed. One of the royal guards, a tall soldier with piercing blue eyes visible beneath the shadow of his bearskin hat, had caught sight of him. There was a moment of recognition, not of the person but of the type, soldier recognizing soldier. The guard's gaze lingered for just a fraction of a second longer than it should have during a ceremonial duty, and Michael felt the weight of that professional assessment. The guard, Lance Corporal James Harrison of the Coldstream Guards, had completed 2 tours of duty in Helmand Province. He had earned his position through years of rigorous training and had proven himself in combat situations that tested both his physical and mental limits. Standing guard at the palace was considered an honor, but it was also a duty that required the same level of alertness and discipline that had kept him alive in war zones. As the formal ceremony continued with its traditional music and movements, an unspoken communication began between the 2 soldiers. It was subtle, invisible to the casual observer but unmistakable to anyone who understood military bearing. Michael straightened his shoulders almost imperceptibly. James's grip on his rifle adjusted slightly. Neither man broke protocol or drew attention to themselves, but something had shifted in the dynamic of the moment. The crowd continued to enjoy the pageantry, completely unaware that they were about to witness something far more rare and significant than a routine changing of the guard. 2 professional warriors from different nations, trained by different military traditions but forged by similar experiences, were about to engage in a battle of discipline, endurance, and military bearing that would unfold without a single word being spoken or a single step being taken out of place. The formal changing of the guard ceremony concluded with the precision and pomp that had made it famous worldwide. The bands played their final notes, the crowds began to disperse, and most tourists started moving toward other attractions around London. But Michael Rodriguez remained in his position, and so did Lance Corporal James Harrison. What had started as mutual recognition between 2 soldiers was evolving into something more complex and compelling. James was now assigned to his static guard position at the entrance to the palace grounds. His orders were clear: stand at attention, remain alert, and maintain the dignity of the crown. For tourists, he was expected to be as motionless as the bronze statues that decorated the palace grounds. But his training had taught him to be constantly aware of his surroundings, to identify potential threats, and to maintain situational awareness at all times, Michael found himself studying the British soldier with growing respect. He could see the micro-movements that revealed James's professional competence. The way his eyes scanned the crowd without moving his head, the controlled breathing that would allow him to maintain his position for hours without fatigue, the grip on his rifle that was relaxed but ready to respond instantly if required. These were the habits of a combat veteran, not a ceremonial guard playing a role for tourists. The American Marine began to realize that he was looking at a reflection of himself in a different uniform. Both men had been shaped by similar experiences. Both had felt the weight of responsibility that comes with protecting others. Both had learned to function under pressure and maintain their composure regardless of circumstances. The red tunic and bearskin hat were ceremonial, but the man wearing them was every bit the professional warrior that Michael recognized in himself. Slowly, almost without conscious decision, Michael shifted into a position of attention. His feet came together at precisely the regulation angle. His shoulders squared. His hands hung naturally at his sides with thumbs aligned along the seams of his civilian clothing. His chin was parallel to the ground, his gaze focused straight ahead. To casual observers, he simply looked like a respectful tourist, but James immediately recognized the perfect military bearing. The acknowledgement was subtle but unmistakable. James's posture somehow became even more precise, if such a thing were possible. His already perfect stance gained an additional edge of professional pride. The two soldiers were now engaged in a silent conversation, conducted entirely through military bearing and discipline. Neither was competing with the other, but both were demonstrating the excellence that their respective training had instilled in them. The remaining tourists began to notice something unusual. A few pointed discreetly at the American, who seemed to be mimicking the guard's posture. Some took photos thinking it was an amusing tourist stunt, but a few veterans in the crowd recognized what they were actually witnessing. Two professional soldiers were paying each other the highest compliment possible, acknowledging each other's competence and dedication through the universal language of military discipline. The sun climbed higher in the London sky, but neither man showed any sign of fatigue or intention to break from their positions. James had been trained to stand guard for hours without relief, and Michael had endured much longer periods of motionless waiting during combat operations. What had begun as mutual recognition was becoming a demonstration of endurance, focus, and professional pride that would test both soldiers in ways they had not anticipated. Word began to spread among the remaining crowds that something special was happening at the palace gates. People who had been leaving started to return. Hotel concierge began directing guests to come witness the unusual sight. Social media posts started appearing with photos of the American tourist who was somehow matching the legendary discipline of the Queen's Guard. Neither soldier was aware of the growing attention, as both remained focused entirely on maintaining their professional standards and honoring the unspoken challenge that had developed between them. By noon, the crowd around the palace gates had grown considerably larger than normal. Word of the silent standoff between the American Marine and the British Royal Guard had spread through social media and local news networks. Tourists who had planned to spend only a few minutes at the palace found themselves captivated by the unusual display of military discipline unfolding. Before their eyes, Michael Rodriguez felt the weight of the growing attention, but his training had prepared him for exactly this kind of mental challenge. During his combat deployments, he had learned to maintain focus and composure, regardless of external pressures or distractions. The cameras clicking around him and the murmur of the crowd became background noise that he filtered out completely. His entire world had narrowed to the simple task of maintaining perfect military bearing for as long as necessary. Lance Corporal James Harrison faced his own unique pressures. While he was accustomed to tourists taking photos and sometimes trying to make him react, this situation was entirely different. He was engaged in what military personnel would recognize as a battle of professional will, conducted within the strict boundaries of his ceremonial duties. His training demanded that he remain motionless and expressionless regardless of circumstances. But the presence of the American soldier had elevated this routine assignment into something far more significant. The two men had now been in position for over 2 hours. James's elaborate uniform, designed for ceremony rather than comfort, was beginning to test his endurance in ways that combat gear never had. The heavy bearskin hat trapped heat around his head, and the thick wool tunic absorbed the warming London sun. But these physical discomforts were exactly the type of challenges that his training had prepared him to overcome through mental discipline and professional pride. Michael faced different, but equally demanding challenges. Unlike James, he was not in official uniform or on duty, which meant he had chosen to enter this test of endurance voluntarily. His civilian clothes offered no support or structure, making it more difficult to maintain perfect posture for extended periods. Every muscle in his body had to work independently to maintain the precision that came naturally when wearing properly fitted military dress. The crowd began to develop its own rhythm and personality around the two soldiers. Regular tourists came and went, taking their photos and moving on to other attractions. But a core group of observers remained, sensing that they were witnessing something special and rare. Among them were several military veterans who understood exactly what was happening and felt compelled to stay and witness the outcome of this unique competition. A group of British Army veterans positioned themselves near the front of the crowd, their own military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. They watched with the critical eye of professionals, noting the technical precision that both soldiers maintained. Occasionally, they would nod approvingly or comment quietly to each other about particularly impressive aspects of the display they were witnessing. Local police officers assigned to the palace detail began to take notice of the unusual situation. While they were accustomed to managing crowds around ceremonial events, this spontaneous gathering was unlike anything they had experienced. The atmosphere was respectful and focused rather than chaotic or disruptive. The crowd seemed to understand intuitively that they were observing something that deserved silence and respect. James's commanding officer, who had been monitoring the situation from inside the palace grounds, made the decision not to intervene. The lance corporal was performing his duties flawlessly, while engaged in what was essentially an impromptu demonstration of British military excellence. As long as security protocols were maintained and no disruptions occurred, he would allow the situation to continue naturally. The silent communication between Michael and James had evolved into something deeper than mutual recognition. Each man was now pushing himself to demonstrate not just his own capabilities, but the standards and traditions of his respective military service. They had become representatives of their nation's military pride, engaged in friendly but serious competition that honored both the American Marine Corps and the British Army's finest traditions. The afternoon sun reached its peak, creating harsh shadows across the palace courtyard and increasing the physical demands on both soldiers. Michael Rodriguez felt sweat beginning to form under his civilian shirt, but his expression remained completely neutral. His military training had taught him to compartmentalize physical discomfort and maintain operational effectiveness regardless of environmental conditions. The heat was simply another variable to be managed through mental discipline and proper breathing techniques. James Harrison faced an even greater challenge as his ceremonial uniform was designed for visual impact, rather than comfort in warm weather. The thick wool fabric and multiple layers trapped heat against his body, while the tall bearskin hat created a greenhouse effect around his head. But he had endured much worse conditions during his operational deployments, where survival depended on maintaining alertness and composure despite extreme physical stress. The crowd dynamics had shifted throughout the day as word continued to spread about the unprecedented display occurring at the palace gates. International news crews had arrived and were setting up equipment to document what was being called an extraordinary demonstration of military discipline and international cooperation. The story was being picked up by military publications and veteran organizations around the world. A group of American tourists, upon learning that Michael was a United States Marine, began showing their support in quiet but meaningful ways. They positioned themselves where he could see American flag pins and military insignia, providing silent encouragement without disrupting the solemnity of the moment. Their presence reminded him that he was representing not just himself, but the entire Marine Corps and American military tradition. British military families and veterans gathered in similar support of James Harrison. Many wore regimental ties or small military decorations that identified their service connections. Their presence created an atmosphere of respectful appreciation for the sacrifice and dedication that military service required. Several elderly veterans who had served in World War II watched with particular intensity, recognizing in these young soldiers the same spirit that had defined their own generation. The physical demands continued to increase as both men entered their fourth hour of motionless attention. Michael's legs began to feel the strain of maintaining perfect posture, without any opportunity to shift weight or adjust position. His back muscles worked constantly to keep his shoulders square and his spine straight. But these sensations were filtered through years of military conditioning that had taught him to push beyond normal physical limitations when duty required. James experienced similar challenges compounded by the weight and awkwardness of his ceremonial equipment. The rifle he held had become noticeably heavier as fatigue accumulated in his arms and shoulders. The chin strap of his bearskin hat created pressure points that grew more uncomfortable with each passing minute. But his training in the Guards regiments had specifically prepared him for exactly these conditions, teaching him to maintain operational capability despite physical discomfort. Neither soldier showed any outward sign of the growing physical stress they were experiencing. Their faces remained composed and professional. Their breathing stayed controlled and regular. Their posture continued to meet the exacting standards that their respective military services demanded. To observers, they appeared as steady and composed as they had been at the beginning of their silent competition. The unspoken rules of their engagement had become clear to both participants. This was not a contest with a declared winner or loser, but rather a demonstration of professional excellence that honored both soldiers and their military traditions. Neither man was trying to outlast the other, but both were committed to maintaining their standards for as long as physically possible, while representing their services with dignity and pride. Medical personnel from the palace, security detail had been quietly positioned nearby, monitoring both soldiers for any signs of heat stress or physical distress. Their presence was discreet but professional, ensuring that the safety of both participants was protected while allowing the remarkable demonstration to continue naturally. The support staff understood that they were witnessing something rare and historically significant that deserved to be preserved and respected. As the afternoon progressed into early evening, the character of the crowd began to change significantly. The initial curious tourists had been replaced by people who had specifically come to witness what was now being recognized as an extraordinary demonstration of military discipline. Military personnel from various NATO countries stationed in London had arrived to show their support and respect for both soldiers. The media attention had reached international levels, with military journalists and documentary filmmakers capturing every moment of the standoff. However, the coverage maintained a respectful distance and professional tone, recognizing that this was not entertainment, but rather a serious demonstration of the values and training that defined elite military units around the world. Michael Rodriguez entered a mental state that military psychologists called operational focus. His consciousness had narrowed to the essential elements of his task, maintaining perfect posture, controlling his breathing, and representing his service with honor. The physical discomfort had become background noise that his mind processed but did not allow to interfere with his performance. This was the same mental discipline that had kept him effective during long surveillance missions and extended combat operations. James Harrison drew upon similar mental resources, developed through his Guards training and combat experience. The British military had perfected techniques for maintaining performance under extreme stress over centuries of warfare and ceremonial duty. His mind had separated from the physical sensations of fatigue and discomfort, focusing entirely on the professional standards that defined his identity as a guardsman. Both soldiers had now been standing at perfect attention for over 5 hours, a feat that was remarkable even by military standards. Their achievement was being discussed in military academies and training centers around the world as an example of the level of discipline and endurance that elite units could develop in their personnel. The palace security detail had established a more formal perimeter around the demonstration, not to restrict access but to ensure that both soldiers were protected from any potential disruptions. The British military police worked closely with American embassy security personnel to coordinate their response and ensure that appropriate support was available if needed. A group of military chaplains from various faiths and nationalities had gathered among the observers, recognizing the spiritual dimension of what they were witnessing. The demonstration had transcended simple physical endurance and had become a meditation on dedication, service, and the bonds that connected professional soldiers regardless of nationality or uniform. Young military cadets and officer candidates from nearby training institutions had been brought to observe the standoff as part of their leadership education. Their instructors used the demonstration as a real-time example of the mental toughness and professional pride that military service required at the highest levels. The two soldiers remained completely unaware of the broader impact their silent competition was having on military communities around the world. Social media posts were being shared by military families and veteran organizations across dozens of countries. Military museums were already planning exhibits to commemorate the event. Defense publications were preparing detailed analyses of the training methods and military cultures that had produced such remarkable displays of discipline. Neither Michael nor James showed any sign of breaking from their positions. Their commitment to excellence had created a situation where backing down had become impossible, without compromising their professional integrity. They had reached a point where their personal endurance was secondary to their responsibility to represent their military traditions with honor. The evening light began to change the atmosphere around the palace, casting longer shadows and creating a more dramatic backdrop for the continuing demonstration. The crowd had developed its own sense of reverence and anticipation, understanding that they were witnessing something that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. The silence around the two soldiers had become profound and respectful, broken only by the occasional click of cameras and the quiet conversations of military professionals discussing the technical aspects of what they were observing. The sun began to set over London, casting golden light across the palace grounds and creating an almost mythical atmosphere around the two soldiers who had now been standing at attention for nearly 7 hours. The demonstration had evolved far beyond what either man had originally intended, becoming a symbol of military excellence that resonated with people around the world who understood the dedication required for such service. Michael Rodriguez felt his body approaching the limits of physical endurance, but his mental resolve remained absolutely unshaken. His Marine Corps training had taught him that the body could endure far more than the mind initially believed possible, and that true strength came from the ability to continue functioning when continuation seemed impossible. Every fiber of his being was committed to honoring the trust that had been placed in him by his service and his country. James Harrison drew upon reserves of strength that came not just from his individual training, but from his connection to centuries of military tradition. He was representing not only himself and his regiment, but generations of British soldiers who had stood guard in far more dangerous and challenging circumstances. The weight of that history gave him strength that transcended his personal physical limitations. The crowd had grown to several thousand people, creating an atmosphere unlike anything the palace had experienced during a normal ceremonial event. The gathering included military personnel from dozens of countries, government officials, diplomats, and citizens who had been drawn by the extraordinary nature of what was unfolding. The respect and admiration in the crowd was palpable, creating an energy that seemed to support both soldiers. Senior military officers from both the American and British armed forces had arrived to observe the demonstration. Their presence added an official dimension to what had begun as a spontaneous interaction between two soldiers. The officers maintained appropriate distance and protocol, while clearly expressing their pride in the performance of their respective servicemen. The physical challenges had reached extreme levels for both participants. Michael's civilian clothing was soaked with perspiration, but his posture remained as precise as it had been hours earlier. His breathing was controlled and steady, showing no sign of the enormous effort required to maintain his position. His face displayed the same professional composure that had characterized his performance throughout the day. James's ceremonial uniform presented even greater challenges, but his bearing remained flawless. The heavy bearskin hat and thick wool tunic had become instruments of torture in the warm evening air, but his grip on his rifle stayed firm and his stance remained perfectly regulation. His eyes continued to scan his assigned sector with the same alertness and professionalism that had marked his performance since morning. Neither soldier had spoken a word or acknowledged the other directly, yet their mutual respect and recognition had deepened throughout the day. They had pushed each other to levels of performance that neither might have achieved individually. Their silent competition had become a collaboration in demonstrating the highest standards of military excellence. The international media coverage had reached unprecedented levels for a military demonstration. News organizations from around the world were providing live coverage, and military experts were being interviewed about the significance of what they were witnessing. The story was being framed not as a competition between nations, but as a celebration of the shared values and dedication that defined professional military service everywhere. Palace officials had been in consultation throughout the day about how to appropriately conclude the demonstration. This was clearly a historic moment that deserved proper recognition, but it was also important to ensure the safety and dignity of both soldiers. Military medical personnel continued to monitor both participants, ready to intervene if necessary, but hoping that the soldiers themselves would find an appropriate way to conclude their remarkable performance. The crowd had become completely silent as the evening deepened, sensing that they were approaching the climax of something truly extraordinary. The tension was not competitive or aggressive, but rather filled with anticipation and respect for two warriors who had demonstrated the very best qualities of their profession. Every person present understood that they were witnessing something that would become part of military legend and would be remembered long after they were gone. As darkness began to fall over London, palace lights illuminated the courtyard where two soldiers had achieved something that transcended normal human endurance. For 8 hours, Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez and Lance Corporal James Harrison had maintained perfect military bearing in a display that had captured the attention of military communities worldwide and demonstrated the extraordinary capabilities that elite training could develop in dedicated individuals. The moment of conclusion came not from exhaustion or defeat, but from a mutual recognition that their demonstration had achieved something greater than either had imagined possible. As the evening guard change ceremony began, James Harrison would soon be relieved from his post according to standard palace protocol. Both soldiers understood that this natural transition provided the perfect opportunity to conclude their remarkable performance with dignity and honor intact. Michael Rodriguez, sensing the approaching end of their silent competition, made the first gesture of acknowledgement. With movements that maintained the precision he had displayed throughout the day, he slowly brought his right hand to his forehead in a perfect military salute. The gesture was held for exactly the regulation 3 seconds, conveying respect not just for James as an individual, but for the British military tradition he represented. James Harrison, still bound by his ceremonial duties but recognizing the significance of the moment, responded within the constraints of his position. His grip on his rifle shifted almost imperceptibly, and his posture somehow conveyed acknowledgement and respect without breaking from his required stance. To military observers in the crowd, his response was clearly recognizable as the highest form of professional recognition that his duties would allow. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause that seemed to come from thousands of people simultaneously. The sound was thunderous but respectful, expressing the admiration and awe that had been building throughout the day as people witnessed something they would never forget. Military personnel in the crowd maintained their composure while clearly showing their appreciation for an extraordinary demonstration of the values they shared. As James's relief approached to assume the guard position, the lance corporal executed his ceremonial movements with the same precision he had maintained throughout the day. His replacement, who had been briefed on the situation, took his position with particular attention to maintaining the dignity of the moment. James then performed the regulation movements required to complete his duty tour, each step executed with the same perfection that had characterized his entire 8-hour performance. Michael Rodriguez maintained his position until James had completed his duty rotation, then slowly and precisely returned to a natural standing position. His movements were controlled and deliberate, showing no sign of the enormous physical stress he had endured. His face showed the quiet satisfaction of a mission accomplished with honor, but also the humility of a professional who understood that he had been part of something larger than himself. The two soldiers found themselves facing each other for the first time since their silent competition had begun 8 hours earlier. Without words, they approached and executed a formal military handshake that conveyed mutual respect, professional admiration, and shared understanding of what they had accomplished together. The gesture lasted only moments, but it sealed a bond between two warriors that would endure for the rest of their lives. The crowd began to disperse slowly, with many people lingering to process what they had witnessed. Military personnel from various countries approached both soldiers to express their admiration and respect. International media conducted interviews that would carry the story of their achievement to military communities around the world. Military historians were already discussing the demonstration as one of the most remarkable displays of discipline and endurance in modern military history. In the days that followed, both soldiers received recognition from their respective military commands for their exceptional representation of military values and international cooperation. The story became part of military lore, taught in leadership courses and training programs as an example of the character and capability that military service could develop in exceptional individuals. Michael Rodriguez and James Harrison had begun their day as strangers from different countries and military traditions. They concluded it as brothers in arms who had together achieved something that neither could have accomplished alone. Their silent standoff had become a celebration of the bonds that united professional soldiers everywhere, transcending nationality and uniform to demonstrate the universal values of honor, courage, and commitment that defined military service at its finest.